I grew up in rural Manitoba, and so rural was always an interest for me as a 4-H kid growing up.
Growing up in small communities, so I was from Chatham, Ontario, and my father from a rural community in Ireland. So we had a very strong connection to place and to soil and to land.
Linked primarily to being part of the environmental movement or conservation movement many moons ago.
I certainly got introduced to rural and regional issues when I was doing a master's in environmental design at Calgary.
And I started a project about small islands on the east coast of Canada.
I ended up in a rural area of Scotland, in the Highlands, in fact, in the north.
And then after my first degree, I started working with a small company that was doing sort of IT work in rural communities, and it needed the community aspect to it.
And when I came to work at the Faculty of Agriculture, I was soon involved with the Rural Research Centre, and after a year became the director of the Rural Research Centre. It's a multidisciplinary collaboration with our faculties as well as with other universities and community practitioners and policymakers across the region.
Through that work, I developed an appreciation for local economies, community economies, and how community economic development could be part of the conservation solution.
And I've had the great privilege of moving through careers over geographies in terms of Canada. So dealt with a lot of rural and regional issues at the policy level for provinces, and have moved from Ontario to Alberta to New Brunswick and now in Manitoba.
Through my research, I started to work for the Harris Center as the manager of knowledge mobilization, which essentially got me from focus on small islands, which are all rural, to a much broader sense of rural and remote, because my job is to connect those rural and remote communities to resources and knowledge that exists within Memorial University. And from there, it just kind of ballooned to, Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, and then Rural Policy Learning Commons, and regional development. I have no idea where it's going to stop.
So rural research is an absolute foundation for rural policy. I think it hits at a whole bunch of different parts of rural policy. So rural policy, looking at what can be done to help, rural communities improve quality of life. If there's policy that's developed to sort of improve that or to sort of help communities navigate, whether it's economic, social, or environmental changes that are ongoing, rural research is needed to inform that rural policy, to help rural communities and policymakers understand what's the current reality in rural communities and what could be the potential realities in rural communities, and sort of both the benefits of taking one direction and sort of the costs of taking another direction or maybe not doing anything. So rural research really hits along all stages of policy, whether it's the sort of identifying the policy needs, designing policy, implementing it, or evaluating it. Research is needed at each of those points along that policy process.
At the highest level or the most general level, I think research generally is asking really important questions and then finding data or evidence to help help create a response to that. So the integrity and the interest of rural research is always, in my mind, about asking right questions and then seeking data to help formulate the answer. Even if the answer is unexpected or hypothesize it's going to go one way, it turns out another, that's a really helpful contribution. In terms of its link to impacting policy, let me give you a couple examples. Recently, we've been looking at functional economic regions, and particularly rural regions, and defining that. And we've had the opportunity of working with the Manitoba government a couple of years ago, looking at trying to understand if there was a new boundary definition of municipalities. How do you define community? What might we use? And so we brought in research from Stats Canada And we then applied that model to Manitoba to begin to understand how rural communities where people live and where they work might help define some new boundaries. So that was instrumental in that conversation. We've also, in terms of other areas of contributions, we've been looking at the food industry, food processing in particular, not only in Manitoba, but across Canada. In this province, it's worth about $4.5 billion a year worth of sales. So it's a significant contribution. And so with that, what we've been able to do is think about and talk to leaders in the industry about where is it going. And so applied research helped understand the future of the food processing sector.
You know, it's interesting because I think it impacts rural policy on various levels. Sometimes it might be very direct. Sometimes those conversations that we have with policymakers can eventually make their way into new policy frameworks or the new thinking about public policy. Certainly through the work here, we work very closely with researchers interested in drinking water in small rural and remote communities. And through the Harris Center, we funded a baseline study here in Newfoundland and Labrador that looked at water quality of these small communities. Dr. Kelly Wadden from the Environmental Policy Institute in Corner Brook campus of Memorial University led that study. That study has changed because of the way it was conducted through really deep involvement of communities, municipalities, the umbrella organization for Newfoundland and Labrador municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador, because they were so involved in the project as partners and on the steering committee, it has changed not just how municipally we are approaching issues around drinking water, but it has also pushed many of these communities to consider regional governance models, but it also encouraged them to become more deeply involved with university researchers in a variety of issues, not just water. So we have really seen out of that one project, we have really seen how policy of an organization such as municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador, and municipal policies can change and can really bring researchers and communities much closer together and help them solve some real world problems.
In Scotland, for example, we have some government-funded research centres or institutions that are funded by government on a sort of 5-year program where between the organizations and the government, they decide the policy relevant research that will be commissioned from them by the government. Okay, so they're provided a certain level of funding and then they have to look for funding elsewhere. So you could say that in those contexts, those organizations are providing the research that the governments have requested. Okay, so perhaps the link between what they do and what governments require is probably fairly closely matched. But if I was to take the center the Center for Remote and Rural Studies, in fact, when it was first set up, it was set up to try and influence policy research. And I think that it's a very different ball game, because as a researcher, you can do rigorous good research, but whether or not policymakers, and that's whatever policy you're talking about, including rural policy, but you can't, however, determine whether policymakers will use that research or not.
A lot of that work for me has been based in northern British Columbia, working with colleagues like Greg Halstead and Laura Reiser. Although through various research projects, I've had an opportunity to get involved in rural research work across Canada and even internationally, which is always very interesting. Things like that. But rural development and specifically sort of community economic development remains sort of a core focus of my work. And It's been a wonderful way to get to know different parts of the country, to engage with rural citizens and policymakers and decision makers. I'm always incredibly struck and feel very grateful for the generosity of rural residents and rural people in organizations in terms of the access that we get as researchers to rural communities. You know, you can almost literally just phone up the mayor and councillors in different towns. They're tremendously welcoming. Rural people, I think, welcome for the most part a focus and research. And there's also increasing levels of sophistication, I think, in rural communities of working with researchers. So that's opened up all kinds of interesting terrain around doing community-based research and, you know, research that fulfills an academic purpose, but also hopefully gives back to the rural communities where we're doing the work.
Many senators and folks in Canada have come to the realization that using GDP or GNP is woefully inadequate to measure what we are about as a society. So we've come up with the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator, that was developed by Ron Coleman in Nova Scotia, and then in Ontario at the University of Waterloo is the Canadian Index of Wellbeing that considers 8 major dimensions that constitute really quality of life. What would we say are necessary to have a quality of life in rural settings as well as in urban settings? And they're often similar, but we've done some work around updating the Canadian Index of Wellbeing to have a rural orientation.
By virtue of my role now in the Resource Environmental Management program at SFU, we have a community planning program. So I'm getting more involved in planning issues of infrastructure, looking at natural asset infrastructure.
Working for 10 years in website, technical sort of IT and rural communities got me really interested in how do rural communities use technology? How do they want to use technology? And so when I got back into academia, that was one of those questions I was really interested in. And RDI, we did a couple of projects here at RDI around rural broadband. And I ended up, that's what I'm focusing my PhD research on, is sort of digital technologies beyond rural broadband. So including, you know, mobile phones or 3D printers, all sorts of digital technologies, and specifically youth. So how can rural youth help lead rural communities to adopt digital technologies? That's essentially what my PhD research is focusing on, trying to figure out ways to help rural youth lead their communities sort of into the knowledge economy, or if they're already in the knowledge economy, further that involvement.
The sense of rural research for me is both about process and people. In terms of the process, at RDI, I'm involved in virtually all aspects, from sort of looking at and identifying issues and opportunities for research of where new knowledge might add some new insights. That might come from a local issue or a local opportunity for innovation or a disaster like floods, through to working with government agencies, trying to help and trying to contribute to new knowledge, and so bringing in funding agencies. I'm also involved in terms of the research, in terms of formulating the research question, and trying to understand both not only what's the applied research notion of how do you get sort of community-based involvement in, but how do you translate that into policy with getting in policy advisors or policy makers involved early on in the research. So it's using research as really a tool for learning how to do research on one hand, and then how to inform decision making on the other. So dissemination of the information is as important for me as to do the research. And I talked about people, and so process is about the research. The people is about making sure the research that we do on rural issues are connected to rural areas, rural and remote areas, also connected to the people that are impacted by it, as well as people that may have a political or an interest in it, be that a funding agency at the provincial level, federal level, or even NGOs often seek, and businesses seek new knowledge through research. So lots of involvement in rural research in terms of the process as well as the people. Yeah, this is, I think this is at the heart of the Rural Policy Learning Commons in terms of its conception. I had the privilege of being involved in each of the earlier proposals as we submitted them to SSHRC. And really the hope, I think, and it's still being realized over the next several years then of Rural Policy Learning Commons, is really to understand what are some of the issues in Canada that are facing rural and remote communities, and where else in the world might we get some insights in terms of policy. And we've currently framed those around 4 or 5 big topics, including Indigenous, including infrastructure and governance and migration, for instance. And if we be able to bring in new knowledge from research from other countries that can inform policy, well, first of all, that's a win. Secondly, if we can compare Canada to other countries or other areas, North America or in Europe, and bring back some of their information to Canada and inform our policies, as well as go the other way. There may be some things that we're doing in Canada that might help others. So this idea of helping using knowledge, research knowledge, to inform policy is central. But equally important in terms of an example, our discussion a couple of years ago in Canada with the CRTC was framed around the role and the importance of broadband. And we very quickly and easily looked into Europe, and many European countries, access to internet is in fact a right rather than just a privilege of service. And so that helps inform where we are in Canada versus where other countries are. So in some ways, the Rural Policy Learning Commons can actually help see the future, if you will, of some of these issues, because we can look at other countries to see what they're doing and how they're addressing some of their concerns, be it food security, food waste, all the way to broadband and other such issues.
Well, for myself, and I'm sure for others as well, the RPLC has really been an incubation space. It's really helped us bridge and build with colleagues. Like we talk about social capital, we've really expanded that through this network, and it continues. So certainly our colleagues in Italy are some that I hadn't met until I was involved with RPLC, and I know they've been involved in Minnesota and other places. But also through RPLC, I've connected with people in Ireland, as well as Turkey, as well as other jurisdictions that I'm hoping to meet up with in the year ahead. So I think having a body, having a network of this sort that has such freedom associated with it, that it really allows connection in a way that's really meaningful to people coming into the network, I think that's really going to be helpful. Certainly work in Turkey, for example, that I'm going to be doing in the next several months, are looking at some of these questions about what are some of the rural planning tools that are available, and how are community members engaged in food development and food prosperity and food resiliency and sustainability that helps to protect rural communities. Because as we can expect everywhere in the world, urbanization is much more attractive. There's a lot more economic opportunities for people in urban settings, and we're losing, as we will see in any of the broad data sets, where we're losing people from rural communities, and Turkey is no exception. And yet when I first was familiar with Turkey, they were so vibrant and so capable of producing their own food, but they've gone the way of most other countries and turning to large industrial development, which means fewer farms, fewer workers in rural settings, and consequently lesser really of a rural life. So Turkey and my interest and passion for trying to do work around sustainability and vibrancy in rural settings, I think that this is going to be a good case study, and same with other communities as well. But RPLC was really the foundation that helped enable us to make connections that I hadn't had before.
Well, that's the great opportunity of RPLC, right? In terms of getting to network across the country and in other countries, finding out what's working in other places. I think despite the tremendous diversity and variability that exists in rural communities, there are structural forces that are similar, that are relevant, whether it's, the impact of neoliberalization, demographic challenges facing rural communities, rural aging, resource community aging, how to deliver in a functional and efficient and affordable way infrastructure and services to rural communities. So, you know, despite the tremendous differences that we can have between countries, let alone, you know, communities 30 minutes down the road from one another, there are a lot of things that we can learn from each other. And, you know, from the policy angle, and I think this is the interesting thing about RPLC and the terrain that we're starting to move into, is really fundamentally grappling with that question of you know, how do you make an impact on policy? And as academics, you know, some of the answers to those questions, I think, are uncomfortable. You know, we find that, for example, evidence doesn't necessarily matter that much, right? There's an intense politicization in terms of how decisions are made. That doesn't mean the evidence is not completely unimportant, but it just means that your windows of opportunity for engaging in policymakers are not evidence-driven. You need the evidence when the opportunities arise, but we need to be employing a whole different, you know, basket of tools, stories, personal interactions, direct networking, to simply gain the attention of policymakers. And then, you know, once we see those opportunities and those windows appear, then we have to be ready with the evidence and the material to back up what we're saying. So, you know, I think RPLC has a way, and I think this is what's exciting about the project, you know, looking forward over the next 3 or 4 years, to both create those avenues of interaction and then actually have all the work. And because we're so well networked with one another now, we can blast out emails about, you know, needing something on the state of infrastructure, for example, or, you know, school closures, or rural health, or, you know, whatever it happens to be. And people step forward with information and material, and we can, you know, we can mobilize resources, I think, quite quickly. But the key is how to employ them strategically and to, you know, get the attention of the policymakers in the first place.
I think the opportunities are tremendous because the network, it took a little bit, because there's so many different partners, it took a little bit of time for the network to kind of come together, for all of us to understand what we are doing, what we are bringing to the table. And I think we are now really at the point where anybody new who is thinking of becoming involved, and those of us who have been involved right from the beginning, this is where I'm starting to see us working closer together, learning from each other. I still hear about that webinar on using social media for knowledge mobilization. It was an opportunity to bring together 3 or 4 different networks. That would be impossible without Rural Policy Learning Commons. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about how other places deal with some of the issues we have here in Newfoundland and Labrador, what lessons can we learn, and what can we offer in terms of lessons that we learned through our work here. So the time is right now to really harness the potential of the network.
Yeah.
So again, comparative rural policy research. One of the things that I think that's really exciting about the Rural Policy Learning Commons is the ability to share sort of policy and research across international boundaries. What we find is that someplace like rural Manitoba might have something more in common with, you know, central UK or parts of Italy than it does with coastal Canada. And so Rural Policy Learning Commons gives us the opportunity to create those partnerships and those networks, and to support researchers coming together to do that comparative research that might not otherwise have been able to engage or had the resources to work together. So again, there's good networks of rural researchers in Canada. We're expanding those networks, but we're also bringing in international networks as well, so that we can bring, you know, a rural researcher from rural Manitoba and connect them with somebody in the US or Europe that is doing similar research in a geography that might be much more comparable to rural Manitoba than some of the research that's happening in the Maritimes or in BC, for example. So.